When you close your eyes and let your mind drift back to the medieval world, what do you imagine? Perhaps tall castles, knights in shining armor, or peasants trudging through muddy villages. Yet beneath those familiar images, everyday life was far stranger, harsher, and more complex than most of us realize. Tonight, we begin a journey into that forgotten world. Not through the clashing of swords or the ringing of church bells, but through the intimate, often hidden stories of medieval life. And perhaps no story is as mysterious and as deeply human as childbirth. Imagine the year 1350. The streets are lined with timber-framed houses, the smell of smoke and animals drifts in the air, and within a small, dimly lit cottage, a woman prepares to bring new life into the world. There are no hospitals, no pain relief as we know it, and little understanding of medicine. Birth was at once sacred and terrifying, a ritual of life that hovered always on the edge of death. Tonight, in this long and gentle exploration, we will walk slowly through that world, letting history unfold like a storybook. Its sounds, its fears, its strange comforts, until you find yourself lulled into the quiet rhythm of the past. In medieval times, childbirth usually took place in the home, inside what was known as the lying-in chamber. This was not just any room. It was prepared carefully, almost ritualistically, to shut out evil influences. Windows were covered, curtains drawn, and the fire kept burning for warmth and for protection. Light was dim, meant to create a womb-like environment, while charms, herbs, and holy relics were sometimes placed nearby to guard the mother and child. Men were rarely allowed in. The world of birth was considered women's business, attended by the midwife and a circle of female relatives or neighbors. The midwife herself was both respected and feared, seen as a necessary figure, yet one who held dangerous power over life and death. Her knowledge was passed not through books, but through generations of practice, whispered secrets, and superstitions. The atmosphere of the chamber was one of hushed concentration, broken only by the cries of pain, the murmuring of prayers, and the constant reminder that at any moment, joy could turn to tragedy. For in medieval times, childbirth was perilous. Every birth was a gamble. Unlike modern doctors with their sterile instruments and advanced knowledge, the medieval midwife relied on a combination of practical experience, religious ritual, and folk remedies. Her tools were simple: cloths, swaddling bands, herbal infusions, and her own hands. Some midwives carried charms, little amulets of saints or pieces of scripture, believing these held protective powers. Herbal knowledge was crucial. Sage, pennyroyal, and rue were thought to ease labor, though some of these plants were dangerous, even poisonous, in large amounts. The midwife's reputation rested on her success, and in a world without antibiotics or safe surgery, many labors ended in loss. Yet despite these dangers, women trusted her. She knew the art of repositioning a child in the womb, the tricks of massage, and the prayers to whisper when things went wrong. In some towns, midwives were officially licensed by the church, sworn to honesty, and forbidden to use harmful magic. But in truth, the line between religion and superstition blurred often. A successful birth was seen as both a triumph of skill and a gift from God. For the medieval woman, childbirth was the most dangerous moment of her life. Mortality rates were high. Many mothers did not survive, and infants were even more at risk. Pain relief was virtually non-existent. While some herbal concoctions might dull the senses, most women faced labor with nothing but grit, prayer, and the support of those around them. The church framed childbirth as both a punishment and a blessing, tied to the biblical story of Eve. Women were told that suffering in labor was their lot, yet they also carried the sacred role of continuing the family and the community. During the long hours of labor, prayers were whispered to the Virgin Mary, charms were placed under pillows, and sometimes holy water was sprinkled around the bed. At the same time, practical women burned certain herbs or placed heated stones at the mother's feet to aid circulation. Imagine the sound, the crackle of the fire, the low chants of women urging strength, the ragged breaths of the mother clinging to life and hope. Every birth was a test, and every successful delivery was celebrated as a miracle. When at last the baby came, the room filled with a mix of relief and joy. The child's first cry was a signal not only of life, but of hope for survival. The midwife quickly checked for signs of breathing, rubbed the infant with cloths, and sometimes even dipped it in wine or warm water as a form of cleansing. Baptism was urgent. Infant mortality was so high that parents often sought immediate baptism within hours or days, fearing the child might die unshriven. If the birth had been long and difficult, both mother and child might be weak, and prayers continued even after the baby's first breath. Yet, in that fragile moment, the family rejoiced. The mother, exhausted and pale, was laid to rest in her bed, sometimes remaining in seclusion for weeks during her lying-in period, while the baby was wrapped tightly in swaddling bands. This first cry, heard in a smoky chamber lit by fire and candle, was the sound of continuity, the fragile promise that life would go on, even in a world shadowed by death. Survival after childbirth was never guaranteed. Even when a baby was born healthy, the first year of life was a battlefield against invisible enemies. Diseases we now consider minor, measles, whooping cough, simple infections, could easily take a newborn. Milk was precious, and if the mother could not nurse, families relied on wet nurses, who themselves had to be healthy and trusted. The midwife often stayed for days, guiding the mother through recovery and watching for the dreaded signs of childbed fever, a deadly infection that could sweep through the body with terrifying speed. For women, the weeks after birth were as dangerous as the birth itself. The lying-in period, sometimes lasting 40 days, was intended for rest and healing, though in crowded cottages it was hardly peaceful. Still, this seclusion carried spiritual weight, and eventually, the mother returned to church for a ritual known as churching, a blessing that marked her return to society. Until then, she was seen as vulnerable to both physical weakness and spiritual danger, existing in a liminal state between life, death, and renewal. A medieval child's earliest years were uncertain. Swaddled tightly in bands of cloth, infants spent much of their time immobilized, thought to help their limbs grow straight and strong. Cradles were rocked by siblings or set near the hearth, where warmth was constant but danger of fire or smoke lingered. Breastfeeding could last 2 years or more, depending on the family's needs, and weaning introduced the child to bread soaked in broth, mashed grains, and milk. Childhood was short. By the age of 7, many children were already helping with chores or apprenticed to work. Yet in those first years, parents invested enormous hope in their survival. Amulets, charms, and prayers were used to ward off sickness. Some mothers tied wolf teeth or tiny relics around their child's neck. Others sought blessings from saints known to protect children. Each giggle, each first step, was celebrated not only as a milestone, but as a small victory against the constant threat of loss. Medicine in the medieval world was a blend of tradition, religion, and misunderstanding. Physicians, when they could be afforded, relied on ancient texts by Galen and Hippocrates, focusing on the balance of the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was thought to come from imbalance, and childbirth was no exception. A difficult labor might be blamed on the mother's humors, on sin, or even on demonic interference. Treatments ranged from the reasonable to the bizarre: herbal teas, bloodletting, fumigation with burning herbs, and ritual prayers. Midwives and women healers often had more practical knowledge, but they too lived under suspicion. If a birth went poorly, whispers of witchcraft sometimes followed. Yet amidst this confusion, some wisdom endured. Honey was used to dress wounds, garlic to fight infection, and chamomile to ease discomfort. These fragments of truth, hidden among superstition, were the roots of medicine that would one day grow into science. The Church held immense power over childbirth and family life. Baptism was one of the most urgent sacraments, for without it, a child who died was thought to be denied heaven. This urgency created anxiety, and sometimes desperate measures. Stories survive of midwives performing emergency baptisms with water, or even wine if a priest was unavailable. The Church also set moral boundaries. Midwives were questioned, licensed, and warned against witchcraft. Women were reminded that their suffering in childbirth was part of Eve's legacy. Yet the Church also offered comfort. Saints such as Saint Margaret of Antioch were invoked for safe delivery, and pilgrimages were made to shrines said to protect mothers. Religious relics, such as fragments of saints' bones, were pressed into women's hands during labor. In this way, childbirth was never only physical, it was spiritual, a battleground between salvation and peril, overseen by both earthly midwives and heavenly protectors. To understand childbirth, we must also picture the world that awaited both mother and child outside the chamber. Medieval villages were alive with the hum of daily labor. Fields tilled, animals tended, bread baked, wool spun. Women balanced motherhood with relentless work. After her lying-in period, the new mother returned quickly to her duties, often carrying her infant in a sling while tending to crops or markets. Family life was communal, children raised not just by parents but by siblings, grandparents, and neighbors. Noise and life were constant. The clang of the blacksmith, the cries of hawkers, the chants of priests. Against this backdrop, the fragile cry of a newborn blended into the rhythm of survival. For while childbirth was intimate, its outcome shaped the whole community, ensuring the labor force, the inheritance line, and the continuation of faith. Childbirth was not only the concern of peasants. In castles and palaces, noble and royal women faced their own trials. A queen's womb was a matter of politics, her success or failure measured in heirs. Royal births were public events, sometimes observed by courtiers to prove legitimacy. Yet even queens suffered the same dangers. Death in childbed was common at every level of society. Noble women, however, had access to finer linens, experienced midwives, and sometimes even physicians. Still, wealth could not guarantee safety. Records tell of queens who died delivering stillborn heirs, their loss altering the course of kingdoms. Royal infants were swaddled in silk, baptized with grand ceremonies, and assigned wet nurses, yet they too faced the shadow of mortality. Superstition clung to childbirth no like a shadow, and in the silent halls of power, evil spirits the cry of a newborn carried seeking to harm mother and the weight of dynastic survival. To ward them off, women tied charms to their beds, whispered protective prayers, and burned herbs to purify the air. Some believed that the position of the stars at the time of birth influenced the child's destiny. Astrologers were sometimes consulted to predict the newborn's future. Certain foods were forbidden to pregnant women. Some thought strawberries caused birthmarks, while others claimed fish could lead to deformities. The power of words was also feared. A curse could doom a child, while blessings could safeguard it. These beliefs may seem fanciful now, yet they reflect the desperate need to control the uncontrollable. When life and death hung in the balance, any ritual, however strange, midwives occupied a unique place in medieval society. They were trusted with life's most sacred moment, yet were often viewed with suspicion. Some gained reputations for skill, becoming known beyond their villages. Others were accused of malpractice, negligence, or even sorcery when outcomes turned tragic. The church sought to regulate them, requiring oaths of honesty and forbidding pagan practices. Yet midwives held knowledge no priest or doctor possessed. They were confidants, healers, and guardians of women's secrets. Many midwives were mothers themselves, their authority rooted in experience. Despite their importance, their names are rarely recorded in history. They lived in the margins, respected, feared, and forgotten in equal measure. Without them, however, countless children would never have drawn breath, and countless women would not have survived the trials of labor. Midwives occupied a unique place in medieval society. They were trusted with life's most sacred moment, yet were often viewed with suspicion. Some gained reputations for skill, becoming known beyond their villages. Others were accused of malpractice, negligence, or even sorcery when outcomes turned tragic. The church sought to regulate them, requiring oaths of honesty and forbidding pagan practices. Yet midwives held knowledge no priest or doctor possessed. They were confidants, healers, and guardians of women's secrets. Many midwives were mothers themselves, their authority rooted in experience. Despite their importance, their names are rarely recorded in history. They lived in the margins, respected, feared, and forgotten in equal measure. Without them, however, countless children would never have drawn breath, and countless women would not have survived the trials of labor. Tragedy in childbirth was so common that it shaped medieval culture. Graveyards filled with women who died young, their epitaphs noting their devotion and sacrifice. Ballads and poems mourned mothers lost in labor, casting them as martyrs of family and faith. For the family left behind, grief was mingled with practical hardship. A widowed husband faced raising children alone, often remarrying quickly. Infants who lost their mothers were at greater risk, reliant on wet nurses or relatives. Death in childbed was not spoken of with surprise, but with weary acceptance. Yet this sorrow was softened by ritual. Candles burned for the departed, prayers were said, and the community gathered in solidarity. In remembering their loss, families also remembered the gift of life that came at such cost. It was a reminder of the fragility of existence, and of the quiet heroism of those who gave everything to bring new life into the world. Childbirth defined much of a woman's life. It was not her only role. Medieval women were weavers, bakers, healers, and managers of households. They brewed ale, spun wool, and sold goods in markets. Motherhood intertwined with labor, for a woman might nurse her child while kneading dough or tending animals. In noble houses, women managed estates, overseeing servants and tenants. Some women entered convents, escaping the cycle of childbirth entirely, dedicating themselves to prayer and learning. The lives of women were diverse, shaped by class, location, and circumstance. Yet everywhere, childbirth left its mark, whether through the presence of children or the scars of loss. It was the backdrop against which women lived, worked, and defined their place in the community. As children grew, their lives quickly diverged based on class. Peasant children learned to herd animals, fetch water, and care for siblings. Noble children were taught manners, letters, and the arts of war or marriage. Play was not absent. Wooden toys, dolls, and simple games filled the hours. Yet childhood was brief, a stepping stone to labor or responsibility. By 12, many girls were married or promised, while boys entered trades or trained for knighthood. The survival of those first dangerous years was a triumph, but the challenges of medieval life never truly ended. Every stage brought its own risks, its own struggles, and its own fragile joys. To imagine medieval childbirth and medieval life itself is to immerse oneself in a world of sensory detail. The crackling of fires, the tolling of bells, the bleating of animals filled the air. Streets smelled of wood smoke, bread baking, and less pleasant odors, open sewers, dung, and rot. Inside the lying-in chamber, herbs burned to mask these smells, filling the air with sage and lavender. Candles flickered, casting long shadows on rough wooden walls. These were the rhythms of life, grounding every moment in physical reality. The birth of a child was not separate from this world, but part of it, as natural and as harsh as the turning of the seasons. Despite the dangers, medieval childbirth was steeped in tradition, passed down across generations. Mothers taught daughters, midwives trained apprentices, and communities preserved their rituals through memory and repetition. Over centuries, knowledge grew, sometimes in small steps, sometimes in leaps. Universities emerged, texts were translated, and medicine slowly advanced. Yet in villages, the old ways endured: herbs, prayers, swaddling, and seclusion. These customs connected people to their ancestors, creating a sense of continuity. In a world where death was constant, tradition offered stability. It reminded families that they were part of something larger, a chain of survival stretching backward and forward in time. As we end this journey into medieval childbirth and life, let us pause and reflect. What strikes us most is not only the hardship but the humanity, the mothers who braved pain, the midwives who carried secret wisdom, the fathers and families who hoped, prayed, and mourned. Each cry of a newborn was a fragile promise, a flicker of hope against the darkness. Tonight, as you rest, imagine the quiet of that lying-in chamber, the glow of the fire, the murmur of women's voices, the breathless anticipation of life. The story of childbirth in medieval times is not just history. It is a lullaby of endurance, whispered through the centuries, reminding us that even in the harshest of worlds, the rhythm of birth and renewal has always carried humanity forward.